You asked a really good question about the whole API component. So let me give you the background sort of how that came to be, because it's kind of an interesting story. So when I joined Experian 2 years ago, one of the first things I noticed was, we have enormous amounts of information that we either subscribe to or we get from the financial institutions, but one way or another, we constantly adding new data sources and adding to the data sources we have. And while the data is all pretty much owned by Experian, we have multiple lines of business inside the company. And as a result of our growth through acquisition, we have a number, these data sources may reside or may get loaded into Oracle or DB2 or SQL Server, any number of different data backend platforms. And then there's quite a diversity of data schemas in terms of how the data is stored.
So the microservices allow you to not necessarily need to have a fleet of engineers trying to recode or coders trying to recode these changes, but they can subscribe to the service they want. And so you were trying to eliminate friction within cross departments needing access to this. Is that correct?
Absolutely. That's exactly right. I mean, right now, the way a lot of people build applications is like totally different from, when I went to college, you learned Fortran or C++ or PL1 or whatever the language was du jour. And, you had to write all of these services internally yourself. You couldn't build a distributed application unless you were a PhD in computer science. And the first inclination of these types of services was things like DCOM and Publish and Subscribe and Corba, all the old sort of 1980s, 1990s distributed computing models that were the precursor to APIs and microservices. The problem was that a lot of that stuff really struggled to get traction because it was so difficult to use. If you fast forward to where we are now, these services now are very, we have the internet, which can be used as a connection mechanism over a secure socket layer.
And do you ultimately have the vision of being able to move between these different cloud environments with this containerized approach? Like, is it unreal, or is it too big of a jump to say that you would want to be able to move a workload from like Azure to AWS in the future, or is that too big of a leap?
No, that is not only aspirational, it is a requirement. We are incredibly prescriptive about the tools and the technology and the way applications are built, so that it's a build anywhere, deploy anywhere type of model, so that we're getting the developers to focus on building what I would call truly native-based cloud applications. So not only should they be able to be run on, moved from Amazon to Azure or vice versa, we should be able to, with the click of a button, move them from Amazon to our own data center, from our own data center to Azure, or as we need incremental capacity, have certain components that can be run in the cloud as well as on-prem.
Hello, I'm Bill Murphy, your host of the Red Zone podcast. I hope you liked that introduction with Barry Libenson, who I'm going to introduce to you in a moment. And this episode is special, and I think you're really going to like it. Some of you have probably been wondering where I've been for the past 2 months. And I want to let you know that I've been quietly doing a couple things. One is I've been taking care of my business that I've been owning and operating and running for 17 years. It's a managed IT security business, which has been expanding quite rapidly. And so I've needed to really dive in and give it some guidance. And then the second thing that I've been doing is I've been quietly interviewing some of the best CIO talent and also experts in the security arena and exponential technology, exponential performance. So I've been really building up a catalog of people that I can continue to release to you over the next several months. Also glad to report to you that my son is back playing soccer. His back is solid. He had broken his back, as many of you remember, and he tried to return to play, but then broke the other side of his back, but now got the right physical therapists and training involved and dealing with the mechanisms of injury. So he's solid and playing again. So that's what I've been dealing with and working with over the past couple months. And my guest today is the Global Chief Information Officer at Experian. and his name is Barry Libenson. And Barry has responsibility for design and delivery of Experian's global technology strategy. Prior to joining Experian in June of 2015, he was the CIO of Safeway in North America. And then early in his career, Barry held CIO positions at Land O'Lakes and Ingersoll Rand. He also has a BA in computer science from Colgate and an MBA from Duke University. He's one of the first employees also at Oracle when they were only a $19 million company. So Barry and I discuss what Experian is doing with innovation and his role in it. And some of the big ideas we discuss are the shifts he sees with customers requiring access to API layers called microservices, so they can consume only what they need and want. And we talk about how to build a microservices environment for internal and external use, and how IoT is shifting what customers are asking for. And also we talk about taking the costs and complexity out of business in order to help speed up innovation, to drive a better experience for customers. So this is really very, very interesting. This is the first time I've had a conversation on the show about this type of innovation. And I was really fascinated with it. And we continue talking about agile performance to respond to organizational threats, not security threats, but threats due to business disruption caused by exponential technologies. And one of the key pieces of a CIO moving forward is this focus on APIs and really, really diving deeply into understanding how APIs can help make your organization better and how you can use data better. So we talk about using smart hubs, how Experian's using smart hubs to respond to this API economy, both for internal and external transformation. And we really get into a lot of details related to microservices. Barry really understands a lot of the details of microservices as it relates to Red Hat's OpenShift, Pivotal Labs, Mirantis. And he talks about the importance of portability and the use of portable containers as you move workloads between on-premise and off-premise platforms like Azure, AWS, and the tools he's using for that to move these portable containers. So very, very fascinating conversation with Barry. Please go to the show notes. You're going to I'll have links to how you can reach out to Barry afterwards. Also, go to iTunes, leave comments regarding the show. Let me know what you think about it. It helps the show ratings tremendously. So I hope you listen to this, grab a pencil and paper. You're going to want to take notes. And now let's get into my wide-ranging discussion with Barry Libenson. Hello, and you are listening to Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. I interview leaders who inspire me in the areas of exponential technologies, business innovation, entrepreneurship, thought leadership, enterprise IT security, neuroscience, philosophy, personal development, and more. Welcome to the show.
And that whole question what we're doing is really focused on how we speed up the pace of innovation and deliver an evolving way of working with customers. We kind of are coming from a place where the historical way of delivering applications to customers is being turned on its head in a number of different areas, both in terms of software as a service, but also in terms of how information is consumed. And a lot of what we're doing at Experian right now, the emphasis is on addressing those two primary customer concerns, the way they want to consume information and the speed at which we can deliver it to them. And that's the challenge, I think, for everyone right now, and something very much that's on the forefront for us.
So your customers are asking about how they can consume information, the ways they can consume information, and the speed. Those are like two of the key pieces they're asking for Experian. Did I summarize that correctly?
Yeah, and I'll give you a very specific set of examples.
Okay.
The first is that, if you think back 10 years ago, everybody was pretty much delivering technology the same way, with a few, very, very few exceptions. If you were an Oracle customer, an SAP customer, an Experian customer, a PeopleSoft customer, it really didn't matter. You essentially, you paid the software company, and then they in turn delivered a software package to you that you installed and interfaced with that to run your business. The first big shift that we've been seeing steadily gaining traction is the whole software as a service model. People just simply, they don't want to buy applications. They want to pay by the drink. They want somebody else to run the application for them. They don't want to have to worry about what hardware it runs on. They don't want to have to deal with any of that. They simply want to know that they're going to get the capabilities that they need when they need them, and that they're willing to pay for that. But instead of spending tens of millions of dollars up front, they'd rather pay for it as they consume it. And, you saw companies like ServiceNow and Salesforce.com and some sort of early trailblazers in the SaaS world. We're very much embracing, that as a delivery model for our customers. So we have a certain set of customers that I would say will always consume our technology through an application for various reasons, but we also have a whole series of customers now who are consuming the services that we provide as a service as opposed to installing an application. The second big shift is this whole API and microservices economy. So historically speaking, companies like Experian or Oracle or anyone else, whether we were delivering the service to you in the cloud, whether we were delivering the data to you, in an application or through the cloud or on-prem, we were dictating the terms and conditions under which that data was delivered. The new model, and it's interesting to sort of talk about one of the key drivers behind this, which I'll come to in a second, is this whole idea of setting up microservices and an API layer that allows people to connect to your services, but only consume what they want. So if all you want is a single data element, you can ask for that, and the application or the API or the microservice will deliver just that piece of information. It won't deliver more than that or less than that. And you can be very prescriptive about what you're asking for. And what that allows people to do is create applications that they want to build using our data to make better decisions. And that's a big shift as well. One of the key drivers behind that has sort of been this whole Internet of Things. If you've got a thermostat in your house or an alarm system or solar panels or garage door opener, all of these things that connect on the network in your house or out in the world, most of those have an API so that you can write your own interfaces to them and things of that nature. And that model is very much carrying over into the enterprise software space as well, where people are saying, hey, look, I don't want terabytes or, big voluminous amounts of information. I just want these 5 or 6 pieces of information on Barry or on Mike or something like that. And so just give me a simple model for getting just what I need. Those are two of the big shifts that we're seeing in the market that's driven a lot of changes inside of Experian in terms of how we deliver capability.
So
does that make sense?
Yeah, it absolutely makes sense. I want to come back to that, the microservices API piece for a second, but I would like to start at the beginning, and I would like to give our listeners, because we have listeners that, so they're just getting us started in their career, some that are mid-career, and some that I run into, and this is very frequent, are just really wanting to completely reboot who they are as a CIO and what they deliver to their organizations. And maybe what we could start with is, what did your trajectory look like? Can you bring us back to maybe college, and what does your trajectory look like to the point you're at today?
Yeah, so I'm going to be dating myself here, which is okay. But my undergraduate degree is in computer science.
Okay.
So I got my undergraduate degree in computer science from Colgate University in New York back in the day when it was feasible for you to know everything there was to know about technology. So we're going back to the early 1980s here, late 70s, early 80s, where, there was 3 programming languages, a limited amount of hardware, and, basically you could learn or sort of know every programming language there was to know. And that sort of evolved. My first job out of college was as a software developer working for Data General in Westborough, Massachusetts. I wrote code for 4 or 5 years, basically in the mini computer world. From there, moved into more of a sort of what I'll call a business liaison role, where I was still at Data General, but my primary role was to be the interface between engineering and the marketing organization and specific customers. So I worked very closely with General Electric, Westinghouse at the time, a number of other very large enterprise accounts. And the challenge always was, how do you find somebody who can sort of bridge the gap between the engineers and the sales organization to ensure that what we're building is in the sweet spot of what the customer is looking for. From there, I worked for a number of startup companies, including having the privilege of being employee number 190 at Oracle in the late 80s. So I was bouncing between the West Coast and the East Coast. I was living in Boston at the time, but was frequently in California. Oracle was a $19 million a year company when I joined.
Wow.
So it gives you a sense for the changes that have occurred. And then I spent about 3.5 years at Oracle, then went and ran a software company in Northern Virginia for about 11 years, which ultimately I ended up selling. And then took on the role of, I was originally the vice president of e-business for Ingersoll Rand. Ingersoll Rand being one of the, very large diversified manufacturer, very much bricks and mortar at the time. This is sort of like right around 2000, 2001, and very much felt the need to move more into a digital economy. I was sort of tasked with driving that initiative. About 6 months after joining the company, took on the role of Chief Information Officer. Spent about 8 years at Ingersoll Rand as the CIO, then went to Land O'Lakes, was the CIO at Land O'Lakes, the dairy and seed. What most people don't realize is how big Land O'Lakes actually is. They own Purina Feed. They're the largest distributor of feed in the United States on behalf of Syngenta, Monsanto, and their own line of their own brand. And then from there went to Safeway, which is the second largest grocery retailer in the United States, spent about 2 years there. Safeway was acquired by Cerberus and was going to be merging with Albertsons. Not something that was particularly appealing to me, and that's when I came to Experian about 2 years ago. So I've always found technology to be absolutely fascinating. I'm very fortunate. I wasn't good enough to be a professional athlete at anything, so I think I have probably what I consider, one of the best jobs out there. I'm doing something I really enjoy, getting to work with great people and, getting to play around with the same kind of stuff that I would enjoy playing around with, whether I was getting paid to do it or not. So it's a really fortunate situation for me.
I'm really glad you shared that, because I really like the people to kind of see kind of the lens of the trajectory of growth, because one of the themes that we talk about is innovation, and I like to break it into offense and defense. And it's interesting, as soon as we jumped on our conversation, you are completely, offense. You're talking about customers, you're talking about delivering value to customers. And, I didn't prep you for that. We didn't rehearse this at all. It's just the kind of a gear you went into. And I like that. But I also, there's two different types of innovation, and I want to get back to APIs and microservices at a second, but how do you, if you're in a room with 100 CIOs and they're asking you questions about how you add value to the business, do you break it down into offense or defense, or how would you answer that question of how they should think about adding value to the business? What question would be the one that you would say they need to ask themselves?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, and I think it's almost an evolutionary part of the process of me getting to doing the job that I do. There's been a couple of things that have changed pretty dramatically over the last 20 years or so in terms of the role of a CIO in an organization. When I started doing this, my job was to keep the lights on, make sure that the factory systems were operating, make sure that the financial systems were operational, make sure that everybody's laptops and desktop machines were running smoothly. But nobody really perceived technology as a growth engine or as an enabler. Some companies did, but a lot of companies did not. As a matter of fact, I would say there are still some companies today that don't, but the vast majority of successful companies and companies that are growing obviously recognize how critical technology is in terms of being a differentiator and an enabler. And I think what every good CIO, well, first of all, the first part of that, what I described, the keeping the lights on, that's become the new table stakes. I mean, if you can't do that, odds are you're not going to be successful at the other pieces. And to some degree, that stuff's gotten a little easier because the underlying technology's improved. I mean, the hardware platforms have been simplified. There's more commodity hardware out there that things operate on. The software application world has gotten better. You have more SaaS-based solutions that make a CIO's job easier because they're not necessarily responsible for running everything any longer. So that piece you better be able to do, and there's really not a lot of conversation now. If you've got a company that's doing a monolithic ERP implementation, that's sort of a different story. And then you probably want to make sure you've got somebody on staff that's been through something like that, because it's non-trivial. But the real piece and the part of the job that I think is the most enjoyable is the working with my peers at the senior levels of the company to understand what the overall corporate strategy is, and to talk about how we're going to use technology as a differentiator to drive our growth and to provide customers with a better experience. And in everything we do, we don't do technology for the sake of technology anymore. I have a personal role to make sure that the rest of the organization is well educated in the direction that technology is going and the capabilities that it can deliver. But one of my other primary responsibilities, and I think the responsibility of any good CIO, is to understand the overall enterprise strategy and figure out where technology is going to play a critical role in enabling that and helping exceed expectations both of the business and of customers. And almost everything we're doing inside the organization right now has either two components. One is either to try to take cost out and complexity out of how we operate the business. But the second is, how do we speed up innovation? How do we provide a better experience to customers? How do we make sure that we're performing in an agile way so that we can respond to feedback or threats more quickly than we were previously able to do? So it's really sort of that two-pronged strategy, driving innovation, but also effectively managing cost at the same time as you're sort of keeping everything operational at the same time.
Can you innovate by taking costs out? Have you seen that? Like, reducing complexity seems to be a unique capability that could be seen as innovative, but is that how Experian and how you would look at potentially adding a lot of value from the CIO perspective?
Let's put it this way. They're definitely not mutually exclusive. I do believe that the reason that we want to take cost out is not so that it flows necessarily to the bottom line. It's so that we have it to reinvest in other areas. We spend, the same type of percentage of revenue on innovation and technology that most companies would, that are technology companies. But I'd really like to see that spend allocated largely towards innovation and growth and not towards support and running the mothership. And complexity drives that cost up. The more variations of platforms that you have, the more different languages you use, the more different database or back-end technologies you have in place, the less money you have to spend on innovating and driving growth, because that complexity just inherently drives cost. I mean, if you think about it, if I had one database provider instead of 5, I could get leverage with that one and potentially save a good deal of money. But instead, if the spend is spent over 5 different providers, and you can well imagine that in a multi-billion-dollar company, that takes on a dimension all its own, because we're not just talking about databases, we're talking about programming languages, we're talking about hardware, we're talking about co-location facilities, data centers. A lot of that, complexity. But by the way, complexity is probably not the right word. The right word is probably more diversity, because it's not that this stuff is overly complex. It's just, we just have so many to choose from that it adds to the cost drivers. So I don't want to make it sound like it's overly complex, because it's not. It's just overly variable, I guess.
I do like the word complexity, though, because I think culturally some organizations aren't ready for the CIO to play offense with innovation. They're still leaning into marketing and sales and such. And so I often say to the CIO that they can be very, very successful with their lens into the defensive areas or into supporting offense and driving out complexity, because, like you said, it adds that undue burden. But I like your point about being able to reinvest that in innovation. And that kind of leads me to my next question, because I know you have a very robust innovation lab at Experian. And when I was talking to Eric Holler a couple months ago, he mentioned that he sort of meets with different business leaders. And I never asked him about how you interact with the innovation lab. But maybe you could take a few minutes just to explain how that works for you and within the organization, this innovation lab.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, because Eric and I are super tight. I mean, Eric's one of my closest friends inside the company. And so I'm down in San Diego on a very regular basis. And I invite Eric I mean, I almost view Eric and his team as an extension of my team. So, for example, I'm going up to Microsoft for a briefing next month, and the first person I reached out to was Eric to say, hey, I'm going up to Microsoft. Do you want to, is there somebody from your team that you want to send with my team, when I go up with them, or do you want to come? And same thing. I mean, Eric and I, have made joint calls at Cisco and Oracle. And I mean, we have a very close relationship, and my team works very closely with his team. So my organization plays sort of two roles in conjunction with Eric's team. So Eric's team is kind of like the incubator and a think tank on behalf of Experian. And by the way, Eric has teams that are geographically dispersed around the world. He's got, his biggest organization is in San Diego, but he also has a team down in Brazil, and he has a team in the UK as well, all of whom provide a very similar function, which is to work very, very closely with our largest customers to sort of understand the technology that they're looking for, what problems they're trying to solve. And Eric and his collection of really smart PhDs sort of look at ways of applying technology like blockchain, or sort of using cellular phone data to help with fraud detection, and a whole bunch of really cool sort of incubated. Yeah. So what my team does is a couple of things. One, if Eric's having any kind of an issue inside the company, getting the technology that he needs or the support he needs, I'm the first guy he reaches out to. We provide them with their sandboxes, their hardware environments. We support them in terms of anything that they need from an infrastructure perspective. And we also work collaboratively with them to try to determine certain standards. So, for example, when we needed to pick a Hadoop platform, one of the first people I reached out to was Eric to sort of say, hey, which of the Hadoop distributions have you guys worked with? Do you have a particular one that you like better than the others, so that before we start to drive a standard, we make sure that we're, working with your team to not upset the apple cart. So it's a very, very collaborative. And by the way, my chief enterprise architect also spends a lot of time in San Diego working with Eric and his team. I mean, my team is pretty much an extension of his, and his is pretty much an extension of mine. I would say that as far as organization, and by the way, Eric and I report to the same guy. We both report into the chief operating officer. So we're under the same umbrella as well. So it's a really good relationship, and we work on a lot of stuff together inside the organization.
Is he essentially floating amongst the business departments to look at ways that customers are looking to consume information and looking at speed of the two major points you brought up earlier, and then he's taking those back, and then you're actually trying to figure out ways to kind of integrate what their findings are so that it can scale across the whole organization. Is that a correct assumption?
Yeah, though a lot of what Eric's team focuses on is analytics and sort of looking at ways to solve complex math problems or technical or decisioning problems. So Eric's team tends to focus less on sort of like my team, my organization was the one that said, hey, look, we need to create an API hub for the enterprise so that we have a better way of sharing information both internally and externally. That's not something that Eric's team would do. We help facilitate it by providing the environment that he needs to run it, and to make sure that our network is configured to allow them to operate that way. But sort of the idea generation for that product came out of Eric's organization, not out of mine.
Okay, excellent. And so that leads me to the API piece. So I'm sure you read the book Exponential Organizations by Salim. And if you haven't, then serendipitously, it was interesting because one of the sections about the CIO is the use of APIs moving forward, and specifically for the reason you mentioned, which is the enabler to data access. And that, how did you come up with this idea of the API hub, and how does it frame your thinking now moving forward with either how your organization consumes from others or how you're providing that to your customers?
So when I joined Experian 2 years ago, one of the first things I noticed was, we have enormous amounts of information that we either subscribe to or we get from the financial institutions, but one way or another, we constantly adding new data sources and adding to the data sources we have. And while the data is all pretty much owned by Experian, we have multiple lines of business inside the company. And as a result of our growth through acquisition, we have a number, these data sources may reside or may get loaded into Oracle or DB2 or SQL Server, any number of different data backend platforms. And then there's quite a diversity of data schemas in terms of how the data is stored. And the issue with that was that if you're in one part of Experian and you want access to a certain data source, we can give you access, but the problem was the data schema. The complexity of how the data is stored made it very difficult for people to share information internally. And the other issue was that as we started to consolidate these data sources onto a common set of platforms, you ran the risk of breaking a whole bunch of interfaces. And so the first idea was, we're going to create an API hub that all of the lines of business can leverage to register entry points so that people can access their information internally. So that if I'm in the credit services organization and somebody in the decision analytics organization wants to access my information, I'm going to give them a bunch of API methods, entry points, and microservices to get at that data so that I don't have to be providing them with engineers to help them write their code. Oh, and by the way, if I decide ultimately that I'm going to change from Oracle or DB2 or SQL Server to Hadoop or some other back-end platform, their code won't break, because if they use an API hub to gain access to it, and I change out the back end, it doesn't change the API, it only changes how the data is stored. And as long as we don't deprecate those API calls, everything will be great. So the idea was to set up an environment that would allow to help accelerate innovation inside of Experian by providing this set of microservices and API methods for sharing data internally. And that was received, very well. Everybody sort of agreed, yeah, this is something that would be really helpful to have. Then, as we started to talk about it more and more, we started to hear that not only was this something that would be useful internally, but we started to hear that our customers would be very interested in having access to the information themselves that way, as opposed to programmatically. They want to write their own applications and their own programs, and they may only care about a specific data element. So if we gave them an API entry point for doing that, it would give them another way of accessing the information the way they want to, instead of the way we want to dictate it to them. So there was actually 2 use cases that were originally identified for the API hub that we stood up, but the original driver was to help drive innovation internally. And then a secondary output was that, customers, we started to hear from some of the largest financial institutions that they were really interested in accessing the information through microservices as opposed to through an application portfolio.
So the microservices allow you to not necessarily need to have a fleet of engineers trying to recode, or coders trying to recode these changes, but they can subscribe to the service they want. And so you were trying to eliminate friction within cross departments needing access to this. Is that correct?
Absolutely. That's exactly right. I mean, right now, the way a lot of people build applications is like totally different from, when I went to college, you learned Fortran or C++ or PL1 or whatever the language was du jour. And, you had to write all of these services internally yourself. You couldn't build a distributed application unless you were a PhD in computer science. And the first inclination of these types of services was things like DCOM and Publish and Subscribe and Corba, all the old sort of 1980s, 1990s distributed computing models that were the precursor to APIs and microservices. The problem was that a lot of that stuff really struggled to get traction because it was so difficult to use. If you fast forward to where we are now, these services now are very, we have the internet, which can be used as a connection mechanism over a secure socket layer. People are learning how to write these kinds of programs right out of school. Today, I would say, and I don't mean this in a negative way at all, but today a software developer, in many cases, their job is to assemble the pieces and put them together. It's not necessarily to write code the same way. And the more microservices and the more out-of-the-box capabilities that you give to them that they can connect to or use, the less code they have to write. And so there is sort of this big movement toward, and that's a big part of this whole push around things like platform as a service, whether it's the AWS platform or the Azure platform or the Google platform. I mean, there's underlying technology that runs in all of these platform as a service environments. But the real objective is to make people more productive more quickly so that they're not having to write as much code. They're more sort of assembling Lego blocks as opposed to building the Lego blocks themselves.
Yeah, I love that. I love that analogy of Lego blocks. And it was, I mean, you're right on. I was just with a CIO the other day, and they're subscribing to APIs. They're putting an instance of SQL in the cloud in Microsoft's platform as a service, and they want to subscribe to data coming from NIH because that data is needed for their customers. And I love the way he was thinking about it. And it's completely to develop a new revenue stream for that customer that needs data from NIH coupled with theirs that this as an association provides. And it's really combining point one, point A, and point B from two different sources. So I love how this Lego block mentality that you have, because I do believe that is a really nice way for the CIO to add tremendous value. Because you said you're going to go to Microsoft, right? You said you're going to be going there to kind of get an overview of their new capabilities. Is that the way what I heard earlier?
Yeah, it's just sort of, I mean, we typically do sort of our year is we're on a March fiscal year. So at the beginning of each fiscal year, we tend to go to meet with our largest technology partners just to understand sort of what their roadmap looks like. So we've got meetings at Microsoft to go over their roadmap for the next couple of years to make sure that we understand how it's going to sort of interface with our roadmap.
So if a CIO wanted to build microservices, this capability, this API development capability within their organization, and they didn't necessarily have the full resources of Experian at their disposal, what would be a good question that they could ask regarding their team? That's number one, to find out what the skill gaps are that they would need. And then what would be a good question that you could ask either for AWS or with Azure to really start the process of building that capability within their organization?
Yeah, I think the first thing you need to ask yourself in any corporation is, do you have people that think this way or sort of understand the need to build componentized technology stack? In other words, I'll give you the simplest example that I give people for microservices is spell checking. 10 years ago, if you were building an application and it needed a spell checker, what did you do? You wrote a spell checker, or you embedded a spell checker into your application as a piece of code. Today, I can't help but think that nobody would ever want to build a spell checker. You would want to basically, I mean, the only thing that a spell checker needs is you submit a word to it, and it can only returns either it's spelled correctly or it's spelled incorrectly. And if it's spelled incorrectly, it may give you a list of suggested words that you can replace it with. That's all a spell checker does. That's a perfect example of a very simple microservice that somebody could write. You pass it one thing and it returns a yes or no and an array of suggestions in the event that the result was negative. But the question sort of that I think any organization needs to ask itself is, if you were building an application, would you use microservices to achieve that result, or would you write your own piece of code? And if the organization comes back and says, oh, we'd write our own piece of code every single time, then you don't have people that are sort of thinking with the right mentality for building a distributed application or building out a set of services. So I think the first thing you need to do is sort of assess your organization and say, does it have the right thought process in place and the right skill set to build things this way? So I think that's step one. Step two is sort of identifying, you do need to make some choices. And I think the question, so for example, we've selected Red Hat's OpenShift platform as our standard development stack for building applications on any platform. So it doesn't matter whether you're building it in AWS, in Azure, the Google Cloud, on-prem, in a co-location facility. You have to use containers and you have to use OpenShift as your platform, because what that does is it gives us complete portability of the applications that we build so that we can run them anywhere we want, whenever we want. Now, we picked Red Hat's OpenShift because it met most of our requirements, but there are numerous other platforms that you could choose to do the same thing. I think that if you determine that you have an organization that's capable of doing this, you need to pick the platform that you're going to standardize on as an organization in order to drive this type of process going forward. So whether it's Pivotal Labs, whether it's Red Hat, whether it's Mirantis, I mean, they all have OpenStack implementations, you kind of need to identify what your OpenStack implementation is going to be, or what your platform's going to be, so that you don't have 5 different parts of an organization all going off in different directions. I mean, they all may have the best of intentions and trying to do the right thing, but I have a very big, having worked at very large companies and having run several software companies myself, to me, standards is a really big deal, because without standards, you end up with a lot of variation in how things are done, which often reduces efficiency and drives cost up. So, the 2 important things are capabilities and then picking the technology stack that you're going to execute with.
We sort of circle back around to complexity again, and I know you didn't like the word originally, but coming back to standards and making a choice and selection about the standard, and I like you were saying earlier, you're executing on this microservices vision, on this API vision, based on clearly the set of capabilities that you put in place, plus the set of tools and standards you've settled on. So when you're going out to Microsoft, you're not asking them, you're saying, this is what we've picked as a set of tools. Now, how do these tools work on your platform as a service, for example, versus going out there with the reverse conversation?
Yeah, I think that's a maturity question. It's a good observation and a good point. I think it speaks to sort of where you're at in the maturity curve of going forward. I'm sure that, by the way, we did do the other previously. I wouldn't be arrogant enough to think that we knew what the best platform was without doing any due diligence or research. So, before we picked, for example, OpenShift, we looked at a lot of other options and considered them, and we sort of decided that OpenShift was the best OpenStack platform for us. But one of the things, and we've been very, very clear with Amazon and with Microsoft, that we are not going to be using native platform services. We're going to be using OpenShift on your platform because we want portability. We don't want to end up locked in by using native services. And they've now heard that from so many customers that they support all of the common suite of tools on their platform. So you can get Kubernetes, you can get Docker containers, you can get any version of OpenShift that you would like, and it will run on virtually every one of these major cloud providers' platforms, because enough customers like us sort of said, hey, we love what you're doing, but we don't want to get locked into a particular platform. So, for example, we don't want our software developers using DynaDB on the Amazon platform, because DynaDB is native to AWS. And while it has a whole bunch of great capabilities and it's really easy to use and it's really fast, the second you commit to using DynaDB, you lose the portability, and you wouldn't be able to move something, for example, to Azure if it had DynaDB code embedded in it. So instead, we basically have said you've got to use something like Cassandra or Postgres or MySQL, or one of the more portable container, something that could be containerized into a volume that's not a native service, but that is portable. So, yeah, when we talk to Microsoft now, or when we talk to Amazon, or when we talk to Google, it's more about, tell us about the tools that you have on the platform. Tell us about what you're building that's portable across all the other cloud platforms. Where are you headed from a disaster recovery and business continuity perspective? What can we expect from a reliability standpoint? I mean, in our business, we obviously are looking for a minimum of 4 nines, preferably 5 nines of uptime guarantee. Those kinds of things. Those are more of the types of conversations than, hey, tell us about what are the differences between Azure and Amazon.
And do you ultimately have the vision of being able to move between these different cloud environments with this containerized approach? Like, is it unreal, or is it too big of a jump to say that you would want to be able to move a workload from like Azure to AWS in the future, or is that too big of a leap?
No, that is not only aspirational, it is a requirement. We are incredibly prescriptive about the tools and the technology and the way applications are built, so that it's a build anywhere, deploy anywhere type of model, so that we're getting the developers to focus on building what I would call truly native-based cloud applications. So not only should they be able to be run on, moved from Amazon to Azure or vice versa, we should be able to, with the click of a button, move them from Amazon to our own data center, from our own data center to Azure, or as we need incremental capacity, have certain components that can be run in the cloud as well as on-prem. So we have one application right now that the lion's share of processing actually occurs in the cloud, but a big chunk of the application is actually still running on-prem. And the reason we built it that way is because it's got a lot of seasonality to it. And if we had to invest in all of the hardware stack that was necessary to run it during peak, 90% of the time that hardware would be sitting around and be idle or not necessarily consumed, or we would have to put another workload on it. Whereas if we built it as a hybrid application where some of it's running in the cloud and some of it's running on-prem, as we need incremental capacity, it can auto-scale in the cloud so that if all of a sudden it's Christmas time and the utilization goes up in order of magnitude, the cloud provider will automatically burst the capacity to meet our demand without us having to do anything. Whereas if it's running if that chunk of it's running in my data center or our data center, all of a sudden, I get a phone call in the middle of the night saying we need to spend $1 million to buy a bunch of additional blades to support the fraud application that's running in McKinney because it's about to hit its limitations. Those are not phone calls we like getting. So, this hybrid cloud development gives us a lot of bursting capacity that we didn't previously have.
Well, I love this conversation because it's essentially, I think, look at it as kind of the tip of the spear from a lot of conversations that a lot of people listening is what's possible and what are the guys that are with the kind of the biggest problems having to face right now. And I imagine with having that portability between clouds is not just a marketing pitch, but something that you're really forcing the vendors to make real by your requests. And are you also requiring these workloads to stay in the U.S. or stay in North America? Is that something that falls under you?
Yeah, it varies. So we operate around the world, and every country has different data residency laws. So, for example, U.S. data all resides in the U.S. They're not prescriptive about whether it runs in our data center or somebody else's data center, but it does have to reside in the U.S. Other countries are not as restrictive about data residency. So, for example, India currently does not have a data residency law. So we can run our India bureau out of the United Kingdom. Now, the challenge for us is those are subject to change, which is another reason why application portability is so critical, because if we build out an application that's servicing a certain geography and it's running in one part of the world, and all of a sudden a legislative law or a regulatory requirement comes forward that says, hey, that data all has to reside in Colombia or in Argentina, and it's currently not there, it can't take months and months to move it, and it can't cost millions and millions of dollars. And so this model of using containers and having portable hybrid applications gives us the ability to not have to worry about data residency laws that potentially change on a regular basis.
Well, I want to respect the time. I think we're coming up close to the hour that we had scheduled together, Barry, and I really appreciate you for your time and your wisdom you're sharing with all of the people that are going to be hearing this episode. And just one final question for you is, in this, taking a shot in the dark here, but I think you're going to give us an interesting answer, is, so you worked with Oracle when they were only a $19 million company. And I'd love to know what the best lesson that you learned from your time with Oracle, or for that matter, if you've met Larry Ellison, what you've learned from him, and also what else has been sort of the mantra that has stayed with you through your career, either through mentors or such, that you can share with the audience as we wrap up.
Yeah. I mean, I do know Larry and have been fortunate over the last 30 plus years to get to interface with him, and have also been very close with Oracle in virtually every one of my jobs, both in terms of their application stack as well as technical stack, and have quite a few friends there still. Larry has and always will be one of the most brilliant people I think I've ever been fortunate enough to get to meet. The truth is, it's very difficult to embellish a Larry Ellison story because there are so many of them, and there's quite a bit of truth to many of them. But Larry has and always been one of the greatest technology visionaries I've ever known. One of the most key takeaways for me from the early days, back in the 80s at Oracle, is Larry is one of the most fierce competitors, probably is the most fierce competitor I've ever met in my life. And when Oracle was a small company, there were quite a few database companies that were still in play. You had, Ingres and Informix and Sybase, and it was fascinating to sort of watch Larry's systematic approach to competing and systematically taking out the competition sort of one by one with just an unbelievably relentless focus on the task at hand. And I learned a great deal from that kind of perseverance and that single focus that I think has been useful to me throughout my career. Failure was never an option when you were at Oracle, and it was a brutal culture, but a tremendous learning experience, tremendous number of brilliant technology people. But, that single focus of the company's ability to sort of bring everybody together, moving in one direction simultaneously, was extraordinarily effective in terms of allowing the company to grow and become what I believe it's become today, which is, one of the largest technology companies in the world. And the people that are most responsible for that, in my mind, are Larry and Safra, two people I have an enormous amount of respect for.
And I appreciate that. And as we get wrapped up, Barry, is there anything that you wanted to let people know as far as how to reach you, or anything in particular, any ways that people can reach out if they have follow-up questions for you or clarification?
Yeah, the best approach, I'm on LinkedIn. There's only one Barry Libenson on LinkedIn, to the best of my knowledge. I do, check for activity almost on a daily basis. Happy to interact or, exchange information with anybody through LinkedIn that wants to, keep a dialogue going.
Well, that's great. And I'm going to put links to, I know you've written an API piece recently. I'm going to put links to that on the show notes, links to connect with you on LinkedIn, also more information about Experian Data Labs, etc. But I do appreciate you for your commitment to sharing your wisdom, which is completely, very, very deep well of knowledge that goes back to the beginning of prior to the real internet starting in 95. So there's quite a bit for people to learn from this today. I know I learned quite a bit as well, and thank you for your time.
No, I appreciate it, and I'm going to try not to feel old now.
Well, I think we need wisdom these days as things get fast. We definitely need people that have been there through it all, because there's more wisdom than anything else needed at this point in time. So thank you.
Appreciate it. Great. Okay.
Bye-bye.
So there you have it. This wraps another episode of Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. To get all the relevant show notes, please go to our blog at www.redzonetech.net/podcasts. Additionally, make sure you go to iTunes and leave your comments in iTunes about the show. This helps our show rankings enormously, and it helps support the show. Until next time, I appreciate you very much for listening. Thank you.